Hi everyone, I'm Pilgi Hong at Seoul Digital University. I'm teaching at the Department of Business Administration. I will introduce the digital policies in the COVID-19 era, and I will briefly introduce what Korean government has been doing during the COVID-19 pandemic from the perspective of digital transformation. We are talking about lots about COVID-19 and COVID crisis, but this course is focused on digital transformation. Especially, I'm focusing on digital New Deal of Korea. And in this module, I will briefly introduce the digital New Deal. And in the following module, I will introduce other countries' cases. Course objectives of this module is to understand the changes brought about by COVID pandemic and the new normal. And also I'll introduce the Korean government policies for COVID-19 pandemic. And also I want you to understand what we have done in Korea. And also I want you to understand the Korean New Deal in preparation for the post-COVID-19 era. And also I strongly want you to understand digital New Deal because this subject is focused on digital New Deal. As follows, course structure is, as you can see, first changes brought by COVID-19, and next one is new normal. When we talk about new normal, can we go back to pre-COVID era, or can we just face new normal? It depends on what we are doing in the future. And also I will introduce Korean New Deal and also the key pillars of Korean New Deal is digital New Deal. So I will focus on digital New Deal amongst many policies. And also I'll summarize all these policies. As you can see, we are experiencing a huge change brought up by the COVID-19. So I don't have to introduce again what's going on in the world. And I also skip over all these materials because everyone already knows what's going on in this world. We are now facing a big changes brought about by climate change and also the pandemic like COVID-19 and also the air quality like fine dust or sand dust. So we gotta prepare for the possible impact of the climate change. We call it BC, meaning that before COVID, and AD, after disease. So when we talk about post-COVID, means after COVID we'll face another new world, which is different from the pre-pandemic period. That's why we call it new normal. I'll just move very quickly because we have just 20 or 25 minutes and we have to cover all the materials in such a short period of time. I will provide a key concept and keywords. And we also provide a full version of this text. Then you can go over full version of text and materials. Now move on to the new changes brought by COVID-19, new normal era. We will live in an unprecedented new world after pandemic. I don't have to explain it again very closely because we are also experiencing all different impacts of this COVID-19. In terms of economics of the world economy, global supply chain or global value chain was disrupted in many industries and in many countries, which resulted in negative growth. I wonder what kind of industries are just booming, or what kind of industries are impacted very negatively. In most countries, the negative impact is dominant over positive impact of the impact of this COVID-19. So the impact of COVID-19 resulted in serious social and economic misery and social instability. And also, the burden of the pandemic shock is not shouldered equally, as you can see and as you can observe in your society. And there is an aggravating gap between the countries and the industries and the businesses and laborers. The gap is getting worse and worse. Something should be done. Before we move to what we should do to deal with COVID-19 and what we should do after COVID-19 fade away, I will introduce briefly what the Korean government has done in response to COVID-19, which is called Responses of Korean Government, which can be summarized in 3 T's. First T is testing, and second T is tracing, and third T is treatment. In all the process of these 3 T's, ICT systems and data and digital technologies are used very effectively. I don't have to explain in detail on this one because you can get this information and resources from many websites and materials resources. So simply put, digital technologies and ICT and digital transformation, e-government, and all the activities can make you share the data concerning the COVID-19, and all the parties concerned can cooperate effectively to deal with this COVID pandemic. So first of all, you can use mobile apps and all the data systems and all the pre-existing systems so that they can share all the knowledge, data, and they can track all the contacts, and also they can treat the patients caused by the virus. As you can see, that's not done in just a short period of time. The Korean government has prepared for this kind of systems for a long time, just after we experienced MERS, 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 and SARS. So we just formulated, the Korean government has formulated the ICT plan for the prevention and management of infectious disease in 2013, almost 10 years ago. And also, we had the integrated information system for monitoring and control of infectious disease. Only in 2015. That's why we could deal with and cope with the COVID-19 very effectively. Without those pre-existing ICT system, we couldn't have done it. So you should pay attention to what we have done in the past for the couple of years. As you can see here, we have lots of different systems activities to integrate in response to the COVID-19. And also, it displays lots of information and it shares lots of information with the e-government systems. So in summary, all of these activities about 3 T's and the responses of the COVID-19 are made possible with the e-government system, and all the summaries will be followed in the next module. Now look at the new normal changes in economic and social structures. By new normal, we mean we will see the whole different world in terms of economic, in terms of society, in terms of education, and everything. So digital transformation will accelerate because of this pandemic with the expansion of non-contact activities. The meaning of non-contact activities is usually going online or going virtual. So as you can see in this graph, without this pandemic, the digital transformation was expected to happen 5 or 10 years later. But because of this pandemic, it was accelerated here. So how much was it accelerated? It depends on the situation of your country. Now look at the another changes in economic and social structures here. COVID-19 made us reevaluate and the risk and urgency of climate change. As you can see, we have a whole lot different natural disasters from the climate changes in all over the world. And also, as a result of these changes, social and economic polarization resulting from the pandemic is increasingly concerning. I wonder what country is doing to narrow the gap between the have and have-nots and narrow the gap between the regions and narrow the gap between the industries. But what's one thing for sure is that polarization is increasingly serious. Here we have the impact of ecosystem and the climate change here. It's just interacting each other. But in this case, in this COVID-19 cases, climate change does affect the human and society. Not only the COVID-19, but also other natural disasters, other diseases, and pandemic is expected in the future again. So we must prepare for the pandemic again. So what should we do? Then what should we do for the possible wave of pandemic or future pandemic? Without this, for example, take a look at this one. Without this pandemic, we could have gone this trend over here. We could have gone along with this trend here. But because of the pandemic, our economy and society just dropped over here. What should we do? I can summarize in 3 words. First of all, we must endure this crisis here. Endure. Then we have to revive. Beyond the enduring, we have to revive. Then we must reform our society and government, our lives, everything. So how can we do that? That's what we are trying to explain in this session. So we need a new strategy for recovery and just reforming and transformation. So the COVID-19 shock caused unprecedented economic stagnation since the Great Depression, as you can see. So what should we do? We should do something different from the past. That's why I call it a whole different New Deal. Have you heard about New Deal? Actually, it has origin in the United States during the Great Depression in 1930s. A New Deal has its origin in the United States during the Great Depression in U.S., as I mentioned, and launched by the U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt for economic recovery and economic revival through job creation and national public projects. From this origin, the Korean government just formulated Korean New Deal, which is very different from that original New Deal. And in some sense, it has some similarities, but a different version, a whole lot different from that original New Deal. Why? Because this vision, the Korean New Deal's vision is make Korean a leading country, not just a fast following up country. So we try to transform the economy from a fast follower to a leader. You will probably think of Korea as a fast follower after United States, Japan, and Europe. But we cannot stay as a fast follower to prosper in the future. So the Korean government formulated a New Deal strategy to transform the Korean economy as a leading country. The three pillars of this policy is New Deal. What New Deal? Digital New Deal. And another New Deal is Green New Deal. And also, based on these digital and Green New Deals, we must consider the possible division of society as very dangerous. So we need another deal, like stronger safety nets. We call it Human New Deal. So we have to look at these three pillars of this Korean New Deal. One is Digital New Deal, and second is Green New Deal, and third is Human New Deal, which is described as stronger safety nets. So we can summarize the Korean New Deal in this graph over here, in this picture. And we can also divide this New Deal into a little bit detail. One is Korean New Deal is an enabler or driver for Green New Deal. I'm talking about the convergence of this Digital New Deal and Green New Deal. As you can see here, digital technologies are key to successful low carbon industry because it doesn't produce a lot of carbon. So we can make a contribution to greener world and greener society. Then we can turn these digital technologies into green industry. As you can see here, Green New Deal requires large-scale ICT infrastructures. Why? Because the green industry requires effective digital technologies. So, digital industry and green industry can be cooperated effectively, can be integrated effectively. We call it the win-win relationship between digital and green. Over here, I'll just skip this one because in another module, they will introduce specific projects summarized in 10 parts of policies. Around 20 projects get merged into 10 key projects, which will be explained in another module. And we can call it Digital New Deal and Green New Deal. And I call it Convergence New Deal, which is integrated into one New Deal of two digital and green factors here. It's a convergence. For example, convergence project is green and smart school, digital new deals, and smart and green industrial complexes, etc. This strategy, Korean New Deal strategy is aimed to overcome and thrive after pandemic crisis. First of all, we must minimize the negative impact of this COVID-19. And then we cannot stay there. We have to advance in the future. So we must do something. We must revive. Otherwise, we cannot prosper in the future. So we must endure first, then we must revive. After we revive, we should continue to reform our economic and social structures, right? So strategic objectives of Korean New Deal can be evaluated by performance indicators of the policy. For example, government tried to create initial demand. Then this policy can be evaluated by the number of jobs created by government or demand, the amount of demand created by demand. So the meaning of these strategic objectives of Korean New Deal can be performance indicators of the policies that when we set up the government creating jobs or demand, we can use these objectives as performance indicators. So the government can create demand as a prime pumping, then economic revitalization is expected there. Now also, as we revive and develop, the social and economic gap can greater and greater. So we must take some measures to close the gap or narrow the gap within societies. So the key features of the Korean New Deal can be summarized as follows. I will just skip over this one. And key features of the Korean New Deal involves digital, green, and also it has both short-term and long-term goals in the strategy. In the short term, we try to endure and we try to revive. In the long run, we have to reform, we have to transform our society. And the policy framework of Digital New Deal is as follows. And we have 4 areas of focus and 12 projects. I will skip over this one very briefly because it is provided in the full material and in other module. I again stress the importance of human New Deal. Why? When we try to revive our economy, when we try to reform our economy, when we try to transform our economy or society, there will be likely widening gap within our society. So we must develop inclusive society, digitally inclusive society. That's why we need human New Deal in the Korean New Deal. Specifically, it means we must provide jobs and we must provide social security nets over here. All these policies can create new jobs. All these policies can provide more diversified types of jobs. So, in order to adapt to new post-COVID era, all the citizens, all the businesses, the government should upgrade themselves very aggressively. So what we have to do is expansion and upgrade of vocational training. As a result of this trial, we can narrow the gap and we can build our inclusive society based on digital technology. That is what we are trying to do using digital potential or digital technologies. I will just get to summary briefly. We can ask ourselves, how has the COVID pandemic changed the world? I will not explain in detail again here because everybody knows and everybody experience in your country, in your own job, in your own families. So I don't have to go over again. And what kind of policies, what kind of approaches do we need after COVID era? Can you prepare the future after COVID-19 fade away? Unprecedented shock, unexperienced shock in scope and severity will have a negative impact on your society and our society and your life, your job, and to the global world. So we need a short-term and long-term responses. And also, in this process, we need to make smart use of digital technologies and digital potential. That's why I call it we need for digital transformation and green economy in response to the possible change of climate change. That's how I summarized all the contents in this module. Even though I have 20 or 25 minutes to explain all the contents of this module, you can go over to full text provided in the session. Thank you for your attention and your effort. See you next time.